This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 4. A Fateful Encounter. What an eon of time a few heavy weeks may seem, when an unexpected crisis has inaugurated a new life's calendar. It was nearly 5 months since that sunset hour in which Thurley Ruxton's dream had faded in the sky, and even less since she had taken charge of the work for Major Phipps. Yet it seemed a time that extended far back into other ages of her being. Today, with fates and change once more impending, she felt she knew not what. She was not precisely sick at heart, but perhaps merely overwhelmed and utterly belittled by the size, the indifference, the ceaseless heave and tumult of gigantic New York, the city that, having been made by man, now made and unmade him in an hour. The huge device of stone and iron had received her as the sea receives a raindrop. She was one of a swarm of human beings, all blindly working, as bees seem to work, no one individual for himself alone, but each for all, despite himself, to gratify the law of existence. It was not to be escaped, comprehended, or measured, this unrelenting enginery of life. There seemed to be nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do to lift herself apart. She was simply submerged in the human tide which must rise and fall with the mighty laws that govern the cosmic scheme. She was sitting alone in Central Park, far out on its western border, pondering all her former dreams of rising to some brilliant eminence on which to receive the tribute of the world. The day had been cool. A few drops of rain had driven scores of park visitors back to their homes. Thurley was weary enough, after 4 miles of walking, to be glad of a rest on a bench. During the first exciting weeks of her metropolitan adventure, she had sought with conspicuous success to achieve an understanding of the ways to genuine usefulness in directing the work that Major Phipps was so mightily toiling to produce. She had likewise been confident of bounding soon to splendid things. She had won the Major's approval, his gratitude and trust, from the first of her employment. But she had found herself uncomfortably popular with all his force of clerks, and then her disillusionment had presently begun. The Major was her loyal friend, sincere and earnest in his praise, and that was all. She had neither expected nor desired social equality, or opening of the magical door from the source of this association. She had readily discovered a fairly agreeable domicile. Her wages were saving themselves. Altogether it appeared as if, after all, the commonplace fates had assumed a foster parenthood to guard her on a simple, modest way, regardless of her dreams. A certain sort of utilitarian career seemed in its sphere, even fair and promising, but then there was something that constantly gnawed at her inmost heart. The one brief effort she had made to discover a cousin, Edith Steck by name, whom she had vaguely known to be somewhere in New York City, failed, and had never since been renewed. She had thought at the time that loneliness explained the sum total of her cares. She knew at last it was not that only, but things that went deep as life itself. She had purposely avoided proffered friendship of the useless, unedifying description, choosing to remain aloof from anything save mere acknowledgments of acquaintance with all her fellow workers and the people of the house where she lived. To-day she wondered if it had paid. She almost wished for any sort of friends, provided they were honest and sincere. For 15 minutes she scarcely stirred, sitting there lost in meditation. To what would it lead, this toil and hope, this excursion into the maelstrom of the town? What might anyone situated thus achieve at last, now that she was launched upon the tide? A faint, mirthless smile crept slowly to her lips, freshening the radiance of her beauty. She shook her head, as if her knowing self thus gently rebuked the self of groundless dreams. Well, how beautiful was all the scene! This was almost enough to require. The bright green grass, with scattered leaves of vermilion and amber upon it, the gold and garnet trees, the cool sweet air, saturated full of essences autumnal. Idly she gazed across the park, then at a squirrel frisking joyously by. Thus her glance came presently to rest on a small white object lying on the grass just at the end of her bench. The object was a handkerchief, a dainty lace confection, immaculately clean, folded in the neatest little square, and marked with a small raised design. She took it up. A faint, subtle fragrance was wafted to her senses. The tiny thing was of cobweb frailty. The design was a crest wrought with exquisite art in the tissue. She was holding it carelessly when a muffled percussion attracted her gaze down the level roadway to a shadowed turn some distance off in the trees. There a large blue touring car was leisurely rolling into view, in charge of a bare-headed man, a fine but bored-appearing young Viking who was driving about alone. Thurley, watching, felt a sudden splash of rain, which brought her to her feet with quick decision to move to better shelter. But the shower broke almost instantly, quite unheralded, as if it had spilled through a sieve. It was one of those downpours, swift and violent, against which an umbrella is practically no protection. Thurley raised her silken tent at once, however, and fled to the base of a tree, still watching the car in the road. The driver, she noted, was clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, and ruddy. He was obviously disturbed by the drenching of a robe in the rear of his car, and cast a quick look upward at the sky. Making a momentary spurt, as if to race and so abbreviate his discomfort or concern, he abruptly altered his mind, halting the car not 50 feet from the place where Thurley stood. Then, attempting to leap out hurriedly over his levers and the casing for extra tires, he was tripped and thrown with exceptional violence, landing face downward in the road with an arm crumpled awkwardly beneath him. Thurley uttered a little cry to see him plunge so heavily on his untwisted hand. She moved a few steps forward in the rain. He scrambled at once to his feet and turned, his face tensely drawn and excessively white, his left hand clinging to his limber right wrist as he weakly reeled back against the car. That the man was in agony was obvious. The eloquence of pain was in his poise. He could barely stand. The rain beat down on him savagely. Out across the intervening space Thurley ran without a moment's hesitation. Her umbrella was raised, and rain was bouncing from its roof. "You're hurt," she said, as she came to the car. "Perhaps there is something I can do." The man had seen her coming. He gazed at her mutely for a moment, his lips compressed with pain. It's broken," he said. "My wrist." Thurley had come sufficiently close to hold her umbrella above him. It had all been done in obedience to something impulsive in her nature. The man was suffering intensely. She had utterly forgotten herself. "Tell me what to do," she said, in her earnest manner. "I know it pains you horribly. What shall I do to help?" He tried to smile, then closed his eyes, leaning heavily against the wheel, a muscle twitching near his mouth. The rain entirely ceased as abruptly as it had come. "I suppose I'll have to let someone drive me home," he said, struggling with a quiver of pain in all his being. "But I hardly like to impose upon you, to ask you to look me up a man." "Well, couldn't I drive you to the nearest relief?" asked Thurley simply. "It might take so long to find help." He looked at her curiously. His eyes, despite his hurt, burned warmly in tribute to her beauty. He thought he had never in his life beheld a face so nearly divine. And indeed, as Thurley stood there by the car, unconsciously sublimated by her sympathy, she presented a vision that for sheer sweet loveliness could scarcely have been matched in all the world. "You drive?" he said, with no attempt to conceal an astonished incredulity. "Do you mean that you could really take the wheel?" "Oh, yes, if you need my help," she answered readily. "It can't be very far, I'm sure, to a place where of course you will do much better." She hesitated, looking at him gravely, adding, "I couldn't do less. I knew you were hurt. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." "You're very kind," he said, looking at her oddly as before. "I hope you will pardon my wretched limpness. I'll probably feel much better sitting down." "Shall I help you get into the car?" she inquired. "Perhaps you'd better lean on my arm." No, I'm all right, quite all right, if you'll just get in," he replied, and weakly he followed, where she passed round in front of the car to mount the unobstructed side. "If you'll tell me where to go," she said, as she took her place with the wheel in hand and speeded up the motor, "I'll do my best to—" "Down through the park to Columbus Circle," he interrupted, sinking limply in his seat. "Kindly overlook my impatience." She dropped back the brake with her foot on the clutch, set the speed control at the first, and the car glided smoothly up the road. Half a minute later she had shifted to direct, and her passenger nodded his approval. He continued to cling to his wrist. The pain had surged entirely through his system down as far as his knees. It had sickened and rendered him utterly nerveless. Nevertheless, as he looked on her face, he was strangely abstracted from his suffering. A sudden outburst of sunlight was poured down on her at a parting of the clouds, and the gold of it made her a goddess. She had dropped the dainty lace handkerchief down beside his foot, but neither of them knew it was there. Round a narrow curve she swung the car, and the man beside her stared, uttered a smothered note of apprehension, and rigidly froze in his seat. Bearing down on them in criminal madness of speed, two huge red cars with hoods abreast were racing like motion-crazy demons. They practically occupied the road, and to it they clung, each of the drivers stubbornly determined that the other must slack or give off to the side to let the blue touring car pass. Thurley was out at the middle of the road. There was neither time nor opportunity to shift her position. The two wild comets charging lawlessly upon her were scarcely more than 4 feet apart from wheel to wheel. A momentary indecision, a gasp of helpless fright, and she and her passenger, car and all, would be hopelessly in collision with one or the other of the fools in the road, where death might claim them all. The man at her side was out of it. Absolutely cold sweat broke out on his forehead, so imminent did the disaster appear. Even had he held the wheel himself, he could scarcely have known what to do. It happened in the briefest fraction of a minute. Thurley stayed with the middle of the thoroughfare, driving as true as a die for the space between the onrushing monsters. It was far too narrow to let her through when she headed for the gap. She only hoped to wedge it wider. For a terrible second everything seemed hopeless. The wreckage of all three cars seemed inescapable as the coughing minotaurs hurtled upon her position. To the swerve of an inch, a second's unsteadiness, the slightest panic at the steering post, and the crash would startle the air. She was almost upon the race-tied pair when they gave to the nerve she was displaying. Even then they relinquished but a trifle apiece, and between the two, as they racketed by, she passed with a hand's width to spare. "The fools!" cried the man who rode at Thurley's side. Then he sank even deeper into his seat, from sheer relief to all his throbbing nerves, plus the pain unrelenting in his wrist. "That was superb!" A wave of colour passed lightly across Thurley's cheek. She began to realize the strangeness of the situation, now that the threatened climax to the ride had sped away to the rear. "You are going to a doctor first, I suppose?" she said, as she glanced about for a possible policeman and gave the car a perceptible touch of speed. Your hand must pain you dreadfully." "We're going. We'll see," he answered undecidedly. After a moment he added, "Perhaps I can manage to present my card," and he started as if to grope in a pocket with his uninjured hand. "Please don't," she begged. She cast him a quick, inquiring glance. "Is it necessary?" Up to now there had been for her no element of personality in all the encounter. He tried to smile again despite his pain. "Is anything necessary? Anything that you or I did?" For a moment she did not answer. Then she said, "Well, it happened. Here we are." "Yes, it happened. Perhaps you'd rather I'd not introduce myself or inquire who you are?" She coloured. Some way she did not care to confess that she was Thurley Ruxton, ex-teacher of French and German in a college town, and at present amanuensis for a reminiscent major of the army. She some way felt that, for the moment at least, she occupied a sphere far different, and she had come to New York to escape the past and escape her very self. Moreover, the touch of mystery the moment afforded, like a cloak in which to wrap herself, appealed to her sense of humour and the fitness of the situation. She flashed him a sunlit glance. "Your wrist is the only thing that counts." He continued to study her face, to marvel at her beauty, her poise, her mastery over the car. "At least I'd like to know whom to thank," he said. "That would gratify me greatly." Her eyes were on the road ahead. They were lustrous with excitement and her natural animation. "Why attempt it, especially as I'd rather you wouldn't?" she replied. "Well, my impulse prompts a sense of obligation, just as your impulse prompted this." Her face became more grave with sudden realization of what she had done. "But you were seriously hurt. You were helpless. I hope I was not inexcusably bold." "Oh, please," he pleaded. "Please be more kind to a pure, uncalculating spirit of humanism, if not to me. It was my wrist that was impaired, not my discernment." Thurley made no immediate reply. Apparently all her faculties were focused on the cart. They rode for a time in silence. "Oh, what a splendid team! Those horses!" she presently exclaimed, partly to relieve the situation that she felt was becoming hard to sustain. "They're beauties." The team in question was approaching in the road far ahead. They were glossy bays, each with white feet that rose and fell in perfect unison. to the tinkle and ringing of the silver equipment on their harnesses. They were driven to a landau of dark maroon, with coachman and footmen in white, maroon, and black. On the cushions, alone and discontented, sat a woman well toward 35, in the costliest of furs, and infinitely bored with all the world. The man at Thurley's side glanced quickly from her face to the carriage they were about to encounter. "Oh, I wonder if you'd mind stopping," he asked her hurriedly, "just for half a moment." Thurley immediately threw out the clutch and applied the brake. The woman in the landau had not only seen them approaching and recognized the owner of the car, but was gracefully waving him to halt. Her carriage rolled up beside the big machine. "Well, Robbly Stuyvesant," she said, as he raised his cap, "I see you are in town after all. Perhaps prepared to give me a few more trifling disappointments?" She was a beautiful woman in a somewhat artificial manner, despite a certain smallness of her features. The man in the car attempted to smile. He was still very white. "Really, Alice, Mrs. Van Kirk," he said, "I ought to be ashamed. I am, indeed I am. I thoroughly intended to come last Friday evening, and I counted on tonight, but just a little bit ago—" "Robbly," interrupted Mrs. Van Kirk, meantime gazing in rapt admiration on Thurley at the wheel, "I really cannot consent to another excuse this evening." "I've broken my wrist," he told her simply. "If it weren't for the kindness of—" he turned to Thurley. "Mrs. Van Kirk, permit me to present my deliverer, Miss Samaritan." He purposely mumbled the Samaritan in order to conceal his natural confusion. Thurley and Mrs. Van Kirk exchanged a conventional murmur. "Broken your wrist?" said the latter in genuine sympathy, but studying Thurley with penetrative eyes. "Dear me, that is simply ghastly. I thought you looked a bit peaked. Why, Robbly, this is serious. I'm tremendously sorry. Isn't there something I can do? If you'd rather I should drive you home—" "Oh, thanks, no," he interrupted blandly, "but I trust my excuse is valid for tonight." Mrs. Van Kirk hardly heard what he said, so intent was her inspection of the girl at Stuyvesant's side. Never in her life, she felt, had she seen a young woman more beautiful, more abounding in possibilities, more desirable as an asset, a magnet for a lifeless drawing-room. She was busily wondering who and what she could be, what relationship she bore to Stuyvesant, and where he could possibly have found her. The party of the evening had slipped from her mind for the moment. "Your excuse?" she echoed. "Valid? Oh, indeed it is, my poor dear boy. It's cruel of me to keep you here waiting like this, but at least you'll come see me. You don't walk on your wrist. Both of you come. Do come soon. You'll be out of it, Robbly, driving your car, riding, everything. Do come and let me supply a little pleasure. Goodbye. I'll expect you soon." She nodded and smiled at Thurley quite as much as at Robbly Stuyvesant. Then once again her landau rolled along to the jingling of silver on the trappings. The car with Thurley at the wheel proceeded on its way. End of chapter 4.